D1641, and we disagree whether or not you should relax D1641 while you're still pumping water out of the export pumps. But the most key situation for us is that there is a USGS model that does a much more complete job, according to the USGS, of determining what outflow there really is. And if you use their best available science, there was no outflow, none, for most of the summer, while you were exporting water out of the estuary south. Now, as Mr. BG pointed out, the conditions that creates is that the bay moves into the delta. It's not just about salinity at the pumps. It's about the mixing zone and where it goes, because the smelts are sort of trapped in the mixing zone. They can't handle too fresh water, and they certainly can't handle bay water in most circumstances, or they would live there. The salmon, as has been pointed out, are going to have a horrible reproduction year because of temperature, because of lack of flow while you're holding water for the next occasion. We're not meeting standards below the dams. So, and you'll hear more of this at the at this afternoon, but because Mr. O'Loughlin sort of started the car
All right,
a little early.
Briefly, because you're
Yeah.
out of time.
I'd just like to point out that there are area of origin laws. You may not like them, but the last boards to deal with them thought they were binding. There is a Delta Protection Act, which the last boards to look at the legal situation thought was binding. So the idea that people are coming to you now and saying, well, equity. Well, there's an old maxim that equity follows the law. And so we believe at CSPA, CWIN, and Aqua Alliance that this board ought to take a look at what laws apply. You can do that while you are doing your scenarios, which is a really good idea. But we're going to be involved from now on in times of drought, in collisions about what the law means, what the last state board rulings were on the subject. And, you know, I went to hundreds of days of evidentiary hearings until this board appeared. And now, in terms of the Delta, we haven't looked at the law since you all got here, except maybe Tam. Tam was at the first set in a different role, but it is useful to know what the law is. And it is particularly useful that the members, and you don't need to respond to this, and it's not an accusation, but if you ever wonder whether it would be, whether all of us who stand here and tell you the law is black or the law is white or the law is purple in my case, you might want to hear that in an evidentiary hearing with cross-examination, with the benefit of all of these people who come all of the time and tell you that there's law and then never see it reflected in the orders. Public interest is your guideline, and that's not true. Public interest is a minor portion of your role. The first is,
And then you're about to give us a lecture and you're way over time.
all right,
So
then
your point is made. I get your
won't-
point.
I will make my last point.
Only if it's very brief.
Sure. Would you please take a look in your preparatory work before you find out about the hydrology, and find out today's state of the spread of the Asian clam, the condition of the endangered species populations, and determine before next year whether you want to use emergency provisions in order to take these species extinct.
Thanks. Ryan Becerra for the cities of Folsom, Roseville, San Juan, and Sacramento Suburban Water District.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate your time and appreciate the attention that was given to our comments. It's clear that there were some changes made to the order as a result. As we stated before, within these agencies, there are approximately 500,000 people who depend essentially 100% on diversions directly from Folsom Reservoir. And our experience last year was that it came dangerously close to causing the intake to go dry. And we are headed into this year with less water in the reservoir than where we were last year. So we're in a similar kind of situation, and everyone is very concerned. So with that, I have some specific comments about the proposed revision to the drought contingency plan term. And I want to preface this by saying I think Chair Marcus got it exactly right earlier, and Mr. Obigi as well, in saying that the point of this is for people to start figuring out what to do. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be relatively close so people can figure out what to do. And so the changes that you're proposing, that are proposed for this, would require that the plan be based on a 50% and a 90% exceedance. And I think that's insufficient.
Yeah, you asked for 99, right?
We asked for 99, and I'll explain why. I mean, to start with a 50% exceedance, that's a median condition. So that's effectively a normal year. 50% exceedance is not going to tell you very much. A 90% exceedance is what you might think of as a reasonably dry year. But we know already from NOAA's long-term weather forecast that they are projecting that the drought will persist or worsen over the next 90 days. Right. A 50% exceedance in that situation doesn't tell you much. A 90% may tell you something, but I think a 99% exceedance is very crucial because it allows everyone to potentially plan for a repeat of last year. That's what we're looking at. That's what we need. It's a difficult calculation, and we have to be careful in thinking about it, that to think that a 90% and a 99% exceedance are pretty close, I think that's incorrect. It's more like a Richter scale. A 6.0 earthquake is a lot different than a 7.0 earthquake, which is dramatically different than an 8.0 earthquake. And if you look at exceedance forecasts, 99% exceedance is a dramatically different situation than 90. So it seems to me, even if a 99% exceedance is difficult to do and you're not very sure that it's even close, it tells you a lot and allows you to start working towards planning for what you need to do next. So what I would suggest is, in this ordering condition number 11, that you delete the 50% exceedance and add the 99% exceedance. That will help us all plan for what's coming, particularly in light of the fact that we've got NOAA already saying best available science shows that we are not going to get a lot of rain between now and the end of the year. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I have questions about that for staff. So
Yeah, sure. Me too.
Can you talk, because intuitively, for me, I like what Mr. Becerra is saying, because I think as a group, we need to, at some level, figure out what Australia looks like. You know, that this year is going to happen again, and it just seems a prudent thing to do. How different is what would be in a 99% versus what's in a 90%?
I think it's a lot more speculative than what is in the 90%. There's not a lot of data points to base that 99% projection on. I think that's the biggest problem. I think another concern is that it might cause, concerns that may be unwarranted. The issue with deleting the 50%, I think you need something that's closer to the middle to compare, because
Yeah, I don't think I
if
would
we're in the
want 50.
99 and 90% exceedance level, the assumption is that something is there's probably going to be needed changes, or there's probably going to be some trade-offs that are needed given the storage conditions that we're currently in. So I think you need some bar for, well, if we're not that bad, but we're sort of bad, what do we do too? We did explore the 99% last year with the projects, and they had major concerns relative to the accuracy of that information. They may be better able to speak to comments they have on whether and how good that information would be.
But is the issue is not so much, again, this is, I've been in operations, and I understand the operation sensibility to spend your time planning on things that are likely to happen or really likely to happen, and not wanting to spend time speculating. I think it is just as likely that we won't get any rain, that we'll get more. And so doing the percentages and not doing a dramatically terrible year is a problem. But it could again be, going back to my conversations with Mr. Fujitani, the level of detail that we're asking for. I definitely think, and we'll be advocating internally, that we do a scenario at some level that we don't get any more rain of significance, just so that we know what that worst case scenario is, and we know what we might do in that circumstance. What we're asking for here is a little more detailed than that. But I also want to make sure we do that. So before I turn to Mr. Lehar, Mr. Fujitani, Tom, do you have any thoughts? I'm torn between, I think, I understand where you're coming from, and intuitively I feel that way. I'm trying to figure out what you would do in this, whether we do this in the order or not.
And if I could,
Yeah.
it may be that you slice it off in smaller chunks, 3 months versus the rest of the year, or something like that. But, I mean, the practical consequences of a repeat of 99% exceedance are dramatic.
Right.
I mean, at Folsom, we're going to have to start talking about floating a barge into what remains of the reservoir beginning in about January,
Right.
in order to have it. First of all, our clients would not be very happy with a barge, because we think we can maintain higher storage. But if that's the bottom line, black and white, nuclear option, you can't float a barge on 2 weeks' notice. It takes 4 months. And last year, before the rains in February, the projection was the water would be below the intake by the end of March. I mean, we don't want to go into this next year with, 8 weeks of notice that we're going to be completely dry.
Right.
We have to have as good an information as we can get, as early as we can get it, in that kind of situation, because it's so dire.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Howard?
So I think historically the projects have prepared or talked about operations plan in the 50% to 90% exceedance range. And so to some extent, us asking for that is something that we think the projects are likely already preparing. I think the other, and so it's a manpower issue to some extent. It's quite difficult, actually, to develop a whole operations plan that's actually meaningful for each particular hydrology. So, as you heard the person from San Luis and Delta Mendota, the more we add on, the less capable or able the projects will be to actually give us something that I think is meaningful. The other thing is that I could be wrong. I mean, I could be. It's just that I don't think anyone's going to act on a 99% exceedance forecast. And so it becomes something of an academic exercise.
What do you mean?
Well, I don't think anyone's going to go and make investments based on a 99% exceedance forecast because of the very low probability of its occurrence. Now, I could be wrong. I mean, it could be that Folsom will look at the 99% exceedance and go out and buy a barge tomorrow. But I kind of think that what usually happens falls within the 50 to 90% range. If we had done the 50 to 90% range last year, we would have been in about the right range. And so it's just a question of trying to balance the likelihood of it occurring and the effort it takes to generate the information.
Well, let's talk about the second part of that clause, which is the likelihood of it happening. I mean, that's a gambler's bet, right? And so it's not about gambling. It's about being prepared and thinking through the consequences of it being a 99. The second part of that, which is how much work it is or how much detail is in a plan, is something I'm happy to talk about. But as an administration, we're committed to doing scenario planning, and we've got to do scenario planning for if it doesn't rain. We've been saying that all year. So I'm looking for where is the appropriate place to flag that we do that, because we need to have the hard conversation about what we do for the Folsoms, the Portervilles, all of our other regulatory authorities. It's not all about the petition process. I know we're using this to talk about the drought in general. It's not all related to the petition process, so I'm happy to be directed to another vehicle, but I think not looking at 99% is irresponsible. But it doesn't have to be here, so give me somewhere else for it to be.
Well, I suspect that the projects are not going to do a 99% exceedance scenario, or if they do, they aren't going to advertise it. So I don't think there is another place to do it.
All right.
If I could comment briefly on that, it's not widely circulated, but I believe that they do some rough calculations of 99% exceedance. And it doesn't go out as far as everything else because it's impossible to predict as far. And, you know, of course, if you do get a repeat of last year, it's almost an all bets are off situation in some ways. But we can't not plan for it.
Well,
I mean,
no, we can't, yeah.
And we can't not think that next year will repeat last year, particularly given the NOAA projection. We can't bet on rain, you know, and I think we need to, and it can be rough,
Right.
it can be approximate, it can be short term, but we need something to
Right.
start thinking about what we do if we have that situation occur again.
Right. No, we collectively need it to be
Thank you.
able to do the what ifs. All right. That's our last speaker card. My suggestion, because we should take a short break, is if people want to ask questions first, or we can come back. I'm going to want to noodle with somebody on how to deal with this question and the appropriate way to do it, because I'm going to want something, even if it's a directive to us to do something. I don't know. I want to think about it. And I want to go back over the things that were in the written comments briefly. So are people okay with a 15-minute break, or do you want more? I know you had a long day yesterday, so. Okay, 15-minute break on that clock. We'll come back at 11:20, clock at the back of the room.
I think like this sentence. I'm thinking rather than what I sent you. So this is an accurate description of what we found at first, or finding A4 as the changes. This is also accurate as sort of what we found in some later orders. First we said, well, they still have to bypass float to avoid injury, and then we towards the end added a condition requiring them to bypass all natural flow that are operating in the changes. So this is actually also an accurate description of what he found, and I think that this is the language that Tim doesn't like. So I wouldn't have a problem with making that change if Dee Dee wants it. I don't think it's necessary.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I sort of like to stay with the understand the concern. We don't think it's necessary. This is a general, it's not a finding of the bill, it's a general restoration act. And broadly as an act, the order stopped for the executive director.
Are you talking about what I think? Okay.
Yeah.
So, personally,
Janine, are we shut down?
because often we're not.
Yeah.
As Dana was characterizing, or Diane in particular was pointing out, these really are just some of, this is not a finding of the burden here. It's just a
No,
summary.
this is like where I was yesterday on the water rights issue. It's like, why put something out there that's going to, you know,
Well, but unlike yesterday, where it was really
It's
here, this isn't,
presidential, right.
and this is an accurate accurate statement of what was in the orders. But Dana and I've been, and I still believe that change really isn't necessary. But we were exchanging some different versions of language by Andy's computer, actually. And this is the language. I mean, the problems all seem to stem, as I'm hearing them.
He doesn't like that last sentence, although this part is abundantly clear. We don't think we would pick up the storage.
Yeah,
and
that,
leases.
So,
So I don't, it's in the same paragraph, but ignore what I crossed out.
yeah, just
okay.
so we'd be striking the would continue to meet, and then replace that with required to bypass adequate natural and abundant flows, which is a little bit more precise in line with the subsequent SWRCBs.
This is the finding that appeared in the first series, and then we kind of, as the changes evolved, our findings evolved, the executive director's findings, I should say. So this is also an accurate description of at least what he found in some of the later orders where we were addressing the different situation where there was actually
it's
enough
just
water in
returning
the
your phone.
system for the
What's up?
projects to be effective. So I wouldn't have a problem. I think this is also an accurate description of what the executive director found, at least in subsequent orders, where we were more squarely addressing that particular issue anyway. And I think it would get away from the implication that Tim is reading into this language that somehow people might be.
I wasted 2 minutes.
Well, because the decisions that I don't about the form that they can change the decision. They change the decision. You're going to change it. I think a lot of because we were all dying out here yesterday. You know, kind of measuring device or whatever.
The endorsement of which is right is the Pacific Line showing, well, that's the idea that I said. Absolutely, they've got a pretty good idea of how much outflow there is.
I don't know. There's no question, all this measuring stuff is going on. All subject to
Because the tide brings in.
And so, more money is coming this year.
Thank you.
Who is in charge of that and where it's going is something
Good morning.
making sure that
We'll be reconvening.
are on top of this.
All right, thank you all for your attention and for that interesting and useful conversation with all of you this morning. I know we had a couple of items that both Board Member Diadamo and I had asked staff to noodle, term of art. Can't even think of what the proper word would be other than noodle, during the break. But I also wanted to give my other colleagues a chance to ask questions or raise any issues or thoughts before we get to those.
I have just one, and it seems to me that maybe you, in your noodling, you've come up with this, but it does seem to me that there's not a misunderstanding, but there's a difference between an operations plan and a scenario, and they're just different. And so maybe we need to have a definition of scenario so that we can move into some of these more speculative areas, because I think you're right. I mean, I think we absolutely have to plan on a bad situation. And really, the state water or DWR did last year, because they were stockpiling to I've forgotten exactly what it was they were going to do. They ended up not doing it, but they were going to be addressing some of the problems that they had. So I mean, it's common, it's not uncommon for agencies to do this. And whether it goes into something so formal as an ops plan, I think that probably isn't correct, but we should do something.
What we've asked for is a drought contingency plan, so I think that what that means is open to discussion and through consultation with the State Water Board staff and the fishery agency. So I think, you know, we could do that, extreme circumstance scenario planning exercise, and it perhaps has less detail than the 50% or 90%, and that, I don't think that necessarily takes any editing to the condition. We can add in the 99%, and with the understanding that it would look different likely than the 50 and the 90.
Yeah, the goal would be to not be, I mean, obviously that's the assumption we went to in January, as all of a sudden folks were terrified that we were going to lose salinity control, and tough actions were asked for and then backed off. So it's really just doing that thinking in advance rather than waiting till January to do it. Right. And laying out the scenarios of possible options that we might go for, so that there's more chance for people to make suggestions and to weigh pros and cons of different things, and really in some cases so that we, collectively we across government, but also we collectively across the stakeholder communities on all sides can be challenged to rise to the occasion and come up with ideas, acknowledging the very different trade-offs that may have to be made. I mean, frequently, and I appreciate people not really doing that today in particular, it isn't all that useful as folks come to us and say, you should give us all of what the particular interest we have wants in this situation, because it's so important, when in fact our job is a broader job. So having everybody look at the same kind of potential scenarios and have to own them is also helpful for the public policy dialogue that we inevitably are going to have, and we've already decided to have more of it in public, which I think is good. So.
I have a couple things.
Yeah, go ahead.
Nothing large. I wanted to hear, you know, the commenters today, and in addition to having reviewed the comments on the proposed order. And so, you know, what I was hoping for was some responsiveness to the input we received on May 2nd, I believe. It was a board meeting kind of when we first had more robust discussions at the board meeting about the temporary urgency change petition orders. And so what we heard there was generally concern, you know, as Chair Marcus called it, hurtling through the decisions and the changes and everything, and a concern about public involvement and feedback. So, you know, Chair, in your comments today, you've touched on that issue going forward, is to make sure we take advantage of all of the creative and great ideas, you know, that are out there as far as interested parties, and having them participate more. And so that was my hope with this type of order, was to set the stage to accomplish that, which I felt was one of the salient points that we heard on May 2nd. And so, you know, I'm generally comfortable that we've set up processes by having regular check-ins at the board meeting going forward on drought operations and contingency planning, and having some deliverables. I do support the idea of this bifurcated plan approach going into the what hopefully is a wet season. And just, I'm hopeful then, through having more communication and a forum for more robust input, besides just the real-time drought operation management team, but this will be an opportunity for us to interact and get feedback from interested parties on all sides. And hopefully going forward, we do then avoid some of the unintended consequences that were described today in testimony, whether it be from the agricultural communities, the water users that are profoundly affected by the lack of water due to drought circumstances, and also to the fish and wildlife resources. So we'll have that in mind going forward. I think having a process for the communication will be key. We've made provisions in the order to have a regular check-in using the State Water Board's public forum. And so, you know, I think we're on fairly solid footing, and I appreciate everyone's input.
First, a question, and then I'll share my thoughts. I wanted to follow up on a suggestion made by Mr. Obiji with respect to the draft contingency plan, beginning with the assumption of compliance with D1641. I would expect that to be one of the scenarios that is evaluated and the trade-off discussed in such a plan. Do we need to be more specific?
We don't have to be, but we can be if I mean, we can understand that direction, and we work with the department and the Bureau to develop the plan. We could assure that we get a run. I'm thinking maybe at least a 50% run would be the compliance situation. I don't know if you want to see compliance under every, probably not under the 99, but I'm not sure at what scenario, which scenarios you want to see it in, or if just the
I'll
weather.
I'll leave it to you to work that out, but I think
Okay.
it is important to have that information and understand what compliance with D1641 would require as sort of like the baseline, if you will, for further decisions. And then, so thank you, that was my question. And then I too look forward to and appreciate the comments this morning. I have to say, though, that I was a bit perturbed when there was that exchange with Mr. Fujitani from Reclamation. And my colleagues are very diplomatic, so I think for the third time in a week, I find myself being the bad cop.
I thought you were going to say I was a bad guy.
And, it's a bit disturbing to me. I mean, staff have done a really good job in working to, address the comments received and in proposing changes to accommodate some of the concerns raised by the projects. And yet, we've already, at least from my take, we've already heard today a bit of caveats and cautionary notes and just, already concerns being raised by Reclamation in terms of meeting the requirements of this order. So my question is, well, first of all, I think it'll be good to hear from council in terms of our enforcement discretion and authority with respect to the requirements in this order. But then after that, I applaud and certainly encourage the collaborative planning process that is reflected in this draft order. But is there a backup plan in case things don't work out as we hoped?
Well, the legal answer to that is that board orders and decisions are subject to the board's cease and desist authority. So it could be enforced through a cease and desist order if reporting requirements are not met.
And with respect to your question about a backup plan, I think the condition speaks to the fact that the executive director could take further action based on the drought contingency plan. Also, we're expecting to get comments from the public, so in response to those comments and other information, the executive director may take further action, and I think it would depend on what was being responded to. I think the board could also take additional action. It would depend on the circumstances, what you might want to do, but.
And as a result of the check-in that is done periodically.
Yeah, and the board has continuing oversight over the department and bureau's water right permits and license. So, I think under that authority, you have, some remedies available to you there, but it, would depend on the circumstances. But we've got this regular check-in process, the public input process, and this specific provision to retain authority to take additional action if necessary that I think probably addresses that concern.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yeah, why don't we go to the language you were concerned about?
Okay, so to repeat, I just would like to say for the record that I don't think that any change to the paragraph on page 11 that Mr. O'Loughlin took issue with, I do think it's very clearly stated there that other water right holders are not entitled to
water released from storage for use downstream, whether that uses exports or meeting water quality objectives. But nonetheless, and also, this is not a finding in its own right, as Diane Riddle pointed out. This is a, I think, accurate description of the findings that the executive director made in his orders. But there is a change that I think would address Mr. O'Loughlin's concern and also be consistent with the findings that the executive director made. So if you're prepared for that, I don't have a change sheet. I didn't have time to do that, but I could just say orally what the proposed change would be, and that would be on page 11 of the draft order, the first full paragraph, the last sentence. Delete the phrase, would continue to meet modified flow requirements and adequate flows were expected to remain in the system, and replace that language with the phrase, were required to bypass adequate natural and abandoned flows, so that the sentence in its entirety would read, to the extent that the changes could cause a reduction in natural and abandoned flows, the executive director found that other lawful users would not be injured because DWR and Reclamation were required to bypass adequate natural and abandoned flows to meet the demands of other lawful users of water.
Could you read that one more time?
Sure. The whole sentence? To the extent that the changes could cause a reduction in natural and abandoned flows, the executive director found that other lawful users would not be injured because DWR and Reclamation were required to bypass adequate natural and abandoned flows to meet the demands of other lawful users of water. And that is, in fact, part of the finding the executive director made, that nothing in the TUCP order or orders relieve the projects of their obligation to bypass natural and abandoned flows to the extent necessary to satisfy senior water rights. And in fact, in some of the subsequent orders, a condition was added to the TUCP order requiring the projects to bypass all natural and abandoned flows during periods when they were operating in accordance with the changes approved by the order, and that was to protect third-party water right holders from injury.
Thank you. The only other comment that I wanted to make, a different subject, is first of all, wanted to thank those that are impacted by the allocations over at Friant, especially those that are, farmers and the school district, to put a human face on what's occurred. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the COA and just indicate that this doesn't really seem to be the right place to raise these issues, though I understand why you all would be concerned about it, and would just hope that there could be some discussions, to the extent appropriate, some discussions with our legal staff to better clarify those issues going forward.
Right. Thank you. And so with that, so the wording that you suggest on the 99%, you'll just add 99%?
Yes, we can just add 99%. I think that's a very simple change.
Okay, and as we looked at it, it's to the drought contingency plan, which isn't as defined as an operations plan.
Right.
Okay. But so at least we get it so that we end up with that framework with which to be able to have those conversations. Okay. That is better. I just wanted to flag another, I add my thanks to folks for thoughtful comments as well as the oral comments. And obviously, as I said earlier, a lot of the discussion has trended towards what goes next as opposed to what happened before. And I just want to say a couple things about what happened before. At one point, I think a piece that's missing, there's a lot of pain to go around in a drought. And there's some conflation on some people's part between the drought and between the decisions that the executive director made in concert with the project. and others, and the fish agencies. And I just want to say that those are painful, and these are going to continue to